Hi, everyone. Welcome to Zzeem's studio for another episode of the HPO podcast. I'm Asif Ahmed, and I'm an executive director at Zzeem. And as usual, I'll be interviewing Aaron Roberts, one of the partners at Zzeem. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Zzeem is a consulting and an association management company, and it's a treat to have you with us. Today, we are going to be talking about strategic planning in the midst of uncertainty. And we are going to give you some proven tips to create an aspirational yet realistic strategic plan for your association and ensure that it is successfully implemented. This podcast is part of the High Performance Membership Organization series, otherwise known as the HPO podcast. If you'd like to find out more about what an HPO is all about, just scan the QR code on the screen for more information. Without any further delay, I would now like to welcome Aaron to the show. Hi, Aaron.
Hey there, Asif.
Well, Aaron, there's a lot of ambiguity in the air for a lot of associations right now, as you can appreciate. And we have heard from some of the associations that they don't see the point of creating a strategic plan until there is more clarity about the future. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's a really good question, Asif. And in fact, we saw this during COVID and we're seeing it again now. And I totally get where that comes from. How do you plan for the future when you don't know what the future looks like? But the simple answer is in an uncertain environment, that's when you need strategic planning more than ever. So even though it's more difficult in an uncertain environment, it is even more important than it ever was before. It's important for your members to see that you've got a plan and you're following it. And keep in mind that without a plan, you're just going to be in a holding pattern until the uncertainty resolves. And by then, we might be left behind. So really simple answer, we absolutely need to do this. And just before we start getting into the meat of it and how we can go about doing it, I just want to share with you that for those of you who are regular attendees at our events, the reason we host these podcasts and webinars is to give you valuable information that you can take back to your association and use immediately. And the topics that we talk about, they represent the work that we do. So we hope that when you need some help, you'll reach out to us.
Thanks, Aaron. So let's take a step back and make sure that we're clear on what we're trying to accomplish with the strategic plan. What is the purpose?
That's an excellent question. Often those of us who know we need strategic plans, we go about doing them and we're in kind of a set approach toward the strategic plan. But let's just take that step back, as you say, and say, why are we doing this? There's really only two reasons. Reason number one is the board needs a plan to govern. That's reason number one. The board is supposed to be taking the organization towards a goal. And if the board doesn't have that goal, how can they take the organization towards it? The staff needs focus and direction. So basically, what we need in our strategic plan is we need to know where we're going and how we're going to get there. The staff is going to focus on the how, the board is going to focus on the what. So that's why we need a strategic plan. And those are the two things that we need from our strategic plan.
Excellent. Since our last podcast, the uncertainty in the air still lingers.
Yeah.
So how can we create a plan when it's so difficult to predict the future? If there is at all a need for that at this moment?
In some ways, it's no different than what we would normally do with a strategic plan. I mean, when we put together a strategic plan, typically we try to come up with some expectation of what the future will hold. So in other words, we forecast the future, and then based on that future, we come up with some objectives and how we're actually going to accomplish them. So we're not doing anything different this time. However, since the future is very uncertain, the most appropriate thing to do here is to come prepared with two or three of the most likely future scenarios. We can't just rely on one. So what are the most likely future scenarios? Don't go overboard. 2 to 3 is fine. And then basically what you're going to do is you're going to create a modified strategic plan for each of those scenarios. Now, before that starts all sounding like way too much, I can almost guarantee you that you are going to have a lot of similarities in the strategic objectives for each scenario. Probably the main difference is going to be is that in one scenario, certain strategic objectives are going to get more focus and another less focus. And the action steps that you come up in order to accomplish those things might be different depending on the scenario. So don't think that you're going to end up with 15 strategic objectives. That's very unlikely to happen. Now, how do we get about doing that? Well, depends on how long you have for your strategic planning. But for most of us, strategic planning is going to be a day, for example. And we've got to get these scenarios lined up ahead of time, or we're going to spend a lot of time at the strategic planning session workshop figuring out what we're going to do in terms of what those scenarios look like. So I really encourage you to have a pre-workshop meeting where you actually flesh out the 2 or 3 most likely scenarios and make sure all of your directors are agreed that these are the 2 to 3 most likely scenarios. So when we walk into that workshop, we know the scenarios we're going to be focusing on. Now, once we get into the workshop, you are going to focus on figuring out what the risks and the opportunities are for each scenario. What is your plan to mitigate the risks? And what is your plan to take advantage of the opportunities? So that's how we create a plan when it's difficult to predict the future. We spend a bit more time on it and we have a bit more in terms of options.
We'll get to the risks and the opportunities in a bit, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that, as you know, there are some strategic plans that are an extension to the previous plan, while there are others that just take a different route altogether based on the current needs of the association. Perhaps while creating a strategic plan in this new and uncertain environment, associations might go the second route. What are your thoughts on it?
So what I think I hear you saying is, we could just kind of extend the strategic plan we've already got versus coming up with a brand new one. Is that the question?
That's correct.
You know, I guess it really depends on how successful you've been in accomplishing your last strategic plan. I know we're going to talk a little bit about implementation later, but let's just say for purposes of argument, you've got a strategic plan, you've come to the end of that strategic plan, and you haven't really made a lot of progress on it. Implementation has not been all that successful. Well, you want to bring the same planning to the stage as you did last time. But you want to be focusing on what's changed. Because in an uncertain environment, something has changed. There's a reason why there's uncertainty. So what I would suggest, I know there might be a temptation to say, well, you know what? We've still got our strategic plan from 3 years ago. There's a lot of stuff we haven't accomplished yet. Let's just continue with that plan versus coming up with a brand new one. In an environment like this, it doesn't mean you want to throw out the stuff you did before, but you want to re-examine everything right from the ground up. Don't just say business as usual.
That's a good advice. Now let's talk about the risks and opportunities that you referred to earlier on. Now, what kind of risks and opportunities are more likely in this uncertain environment?
Okay, well, let's talk about risks in particular. It is always a risk that we're going to lose members. And it's always a risk if we've got sponsors that we're going to lose sponsors. That's the reality. And in an uncertain environment, individuals and companies are more likely to cut back on anything they perceive as being non-essential. So those are your risks. And that word non-essential is critical because what you have to make sure is that when it comes to your members and your sponsors, you don't fit into the non-essential category. You fit into the essential category. So two things for sure. The risks of losing members or losing sponsors for sure.
That's true. And sponsors being so critical for all our associates, especially the smaller ones, it is imperative that we take care of them and look at their changing needs. And what would you recommend in terms of how we keep our finger on the pulse?
Well, just in terms of the sponsors, for example, make sure that you're paying attention to your current sponsors and to your prospects. So, in terms of holding on to our sponsors, pay attention to them. And that doesn't mean just pick up the phone once a year and ask them for money. You want to be having a conversation with them right now for various reasons, and we'll talk about reasons related to the environmental scan. Now is when you want to find out what your sponsors are thinking. How are they going to deal with this uncertainty? What's going on in their mind right now? What are their plans from a marketing perspective? What's changed? So have that conversation. Make sure your sponsors are feeling that you care, that you want to be part of helping them to do whatever it is that they need to do, and make sure that they realize that you are open to adapting any of the sponsor privileges that exist to make them more relevant to their current situation. With other thing with respect to sponsors, there's a unique opportunity right now to get new sponsors. If your members are government or pseudo-government organizations for the most part, in other words, large organizations, there's a pretty good chance that they've got a policy in place right now to buy Canadian. We've heard it from all levels of government, and we are seeing it from, academic institutions, healthcare institutions, all of that kind of thing. Now, where the opportunity is here is a lot of them will have, some of their regular suppliers, many of their regular suppliers are probably US based organizations. Now they have to find different suppliers or at least additional suppliers. So they're on the hunt right now for Canadian companies that do the stuff that they need. So they're looking for that. Hopefully, these Canadian companies are smart enough to realize that this is an opportunity and that they've kind of focused their marketing efforts around getting greater market share in the Canadian market. So, as an organization, the opportunity you have is going to serve your members and also to serve these Canadian companies by bringing them together in a sponsorship kind of relationship. So, maybe in the past, you would have gone after the companies that are doing the most business with your members. Now you have an opportunity to go after companies that may not be doing any business with your members, but have a huge opportunity to do that. And what better way to find out what the opportunities are than to enter into a sponsor relationship? On the member side, remember we talked about the possibility of losing members in the current environment. In the current environment, if you want to mitigate against that, the opportunity is to make sure that you are, number one, giving them timely and relevant information. In an uncertain environment, people are looking everywhere for direction. You want to make sure as an association you're providing that. And by the way, your strategic plan is a huge part of that. The other thing to keep in mind is anytime there's uncertainty, there are issues. There's concerns, there are things going on, there might be there might be talk that is negative for your profession or your sector, or activities or decisions that might be negative for you. There's issues that need management. This is a great time to get your members more engaged by striking task forces and committees that can help deal with those issues. And if you can get your members that haven't been volunteers to be volunteers now, that is the most engaged kind of member you could possibly ask for. So when there's trouble on the horizon, people want to feel in control. They are more likely to volunteer if you give them something to volunteer for that shows that they are taking a leadership role in helping to solve the problem. So when it comes to sponsors and members, those are the risks and those are the opportunities.
Excellent. Are there any other risks?
Yeah, I think in the current environment, what we have to be wary of is government programs. If you are reliant for a meaningful part of your revenue on any government programs, grants, whatever the case may be, when there's an uncertain environment, we will probably see changes in programming. So you need to be prepared for that. Um, assume there's a possibility that some of your government funding could dry up. But let's see what we can do about investigating new funding. Chances are, wherever the uncertainty is, government will be putting more money in the areas where they feel they can help with the uncertainty and to help the economy. So think about where that money might be coming from. Figure out whether you as an association fit into the categories that are likely to be beneficiaries of that funding. So be careful of existing funding. It could dry up on you, and keep an eye out for new funding. So yeah, the risks come down to members, sponsors, government funding. There's lots of others, but those would be the big ones that you want to be focusing on for both risks and opportunities.
Excellent. So now let's specifically look at some opportunities. What are those?
Well, really, the opportunities fit into really three categories: your member value proposition, your sponsors, and your government funding. And really, we've talked about them from both perspectives. With sponsors, remember, we've got this great opportunity to introduce Canadian companies to Canadian entities that want to buy from them. In your member value proposition, it's going to come down to getting your members more engaged and making sure that they've got timely and relevant information. Those are the opportunities, and they're really just the flip side of the risks.
Do you feel that some associations might need to revisit their mission statement in this current environment?
Great question, Asif. I find that when we're facilitating strategic planning, I like to revisit both the vision and the mission because really those are our two high level filters, right? Our vision says this is what we aspire to, our mission says this is what we do every day. And you don't really want to plunge right into a strategic planning session if you aren't all agreed that your vision and your mission are still relevant and meaningful in the current environment. So especially when there's uncertainty, you definitely do want to be looking at your vision and your mission. And if you're on a 3 to 5 year cycle with your strategic plan, that's about the right amount of time in between looking at it. You don't want to be changing your vision and your mission every year, but you want to be reviewing it every few years to see whether anything has changed. So, short answer, yes, always, but especially in an uncertain environment.
Exactly. And I also feel that it should be done to see how relevant you are vis-a-vis the new or the changing environment. Anyway, now when we talk about environment, let's talk about environmental scan. Big words, I know, but let's talk about that. And when we talk about environmental scan, I would like you to expand on what that is, and also if that adds any value while when we're creating a strategic plan.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about that. I think it's very common to walk into a strategic planning session and having done a SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But really, in order to know, and of those, I would say your risks and your opportunities are the things you're really looking to identify here because the risks are things you have to mitigate. The opportunities are things that you have to take advantage of. So how do we get to that? How do we know what our risks and opportunities are? Well, we need an environmental scan to do that. And basically what an environmental scan is exactly what it says. It is a scan of the environment. So you're looking at what's going on right now from an exterior perspective and from an interior perspective. What does the environment look like internally to us? And what does the environment look like externally? Where are we now? Once you've got where we are now, from there, it's a lot easier to figure out what the risks and opportunities are. So with that environmental scan, we are getting that context. And then from that environmental scan, that enables us now to come up with our scenarios because we know what's going on. We know what our risks are and our opportunities. And now we can be looking at our scenarios to get the specific risks and opportunities for each scenario.
And when we do the environmental scan, and it's great that you pointed out both internal and external. Usually people don't make that differentiation, but there is. And when we talk about that, we talk about mostly external. My question to you is how critical it is to look at and to speak to the staff when we're creating a strategic plan.
That is a really good question. And in fact, I just recently worked on a project where the organization really went out of their way to do a good job of that. I think what you need is you need staff input before, during, and after the strategic plan has been created. And what this organization did was they made sure that they could got as many staff as they could get out to a particular event and we facilitated table discussions around what do you think it's most important for the board to come up with in terms of this upcoming strategic plan? What do you think we did well last time? What do you think we could do better next time? And we spent a good chunk of time just working with the staff to give their input to the board of directors. Then at the strategic planning meeting, they had their senior management team, they had their board of directors, they came up with a strategic plan. Once the strategic plan was drafted, and I do mean drafted, it was shared with the staff and they were given an opportunity to say, well, does this work or doesn't it work? And we shared not just the strategic plan, the objectives, but also the implementation plan. and the implementation plan is critical. And if staff can't relate to the implementation plan, it's not going to get done. So yeah, staff are absolutely critical here.
Excellent. Now, my next question to you is about government relations. If that is a part of, say, any association's member value proposition, should we modify our approach under these uncertain conditions?
Okay, that's a really good question. I mean, in an uncertain environment, we have to be thinking about whether we should modify everything or nothing. And really that it's kind of a yes and no answer. The yes or the no is the things that we should continue to do that we always do if we're successful at government relations is thinking about what the government priorities are and talking to them in the context of their own priorities. If we come in and our preferred topic of discussion is something that government just doesn't care about right now, we probably won't even get an appointment, let alone get any interest in moving forward on our calls to action. So you always want to make sure that you're pitching your advocacy to government in the context that it is mirroring the government's priorities. So that doesn't change. That'll be exactly the same as it always is. Where you've got an additional opportunity for government relations in an uncertain environment is government, they don't have any better crystal ball than we do. And so they're anxious for information in an uncertain environment. They want to be able to make informed decisions, and the better the information they have, the better off they are. So if we've got information that would be helpful to government, we need to be sharing it. That's a good reason to get an appointment because it's just us giving. We're not there to ask them to do something for us. We're there to share information, to give them market intelligence, to give them sector intelligence, to give government an idea of the risks and the opportunities that are open to government. So yes and no. Yes, the opportunity is you have an opportunity to provide information to government that they probably really want right now. No is don't step outside of government priorities. Make sure that whatever you want is being shaped to what their priorities are, or you won't get a foot in the door.
Right. And in other words, what is in it for them? That needs to be identified.
Exactly, exactly. Whether it's a member, whether it's a sponsor, or whether it's government, you always have to think about what's in it for them. And if I'm not delivering that, they're not listening.
Exactly. Now, let's touch upon uh, an item that you just discussed or kind of touched upon yourself a little bit earlier, and that is the implementation bit of the strategic plan. Let's suppose we have a new strategic plan and it's all ready to go, and we need to implement it. What would you say is, in your experience slash best practices, the best way of having that implemented?
Yeah, I mean, really, 99% of the strategic planning process is implementation. You can have the best strategic plan in the world, but there has to be a way to get it implemented. So really what you need here are two things. In order to have a successful implementation of your strategic plan, in other words, basically what we said we're going to do gets done, you need two things. Number one, you need a roadmap. And number two, you need explicit board oversight. This is more than, let's talk about the board oversight first. This is more than just reporting to the board on, where we are on our objectives. Sometimes that can just be something that, goes in one ear and out the other ear of the board. You want to make sure your board is invested in making sure that stuff is happening. And if it's not happening, that the board is asking why and what can we do to make it happen. So the board needs to be actively engaged in oversight. That's critical for implementation because we all pay attention to our bosses. And the CEO is going to be paying attention to how much attention the board is paying to the strategic plan. And if they're bored and they want to talk about other things, the CEO is going to have to make their own decisions about where their priorities are. So explicit board oversight. Second thing is, and this is equally important, is the roadmap. And basically what you need is, I've seen strategic plans where you've got three excellent objectives, and that's perfect. That's just about the right amount. And that is pretty much the strategic plan. The rest is just kind of intro and thanks very much. What we need here is for each objective, we need an action plan, a series of action steps. So If it is our goal to, increase our visibility within our sector by such and such, that's the objective. We need what exactly are the action steps we're going to do to get there? We need to list those action steps, and for each action step, we need a date by which it will be accomplished. We need to know who's responsible for that. So they're the person that's going to be reporting to the board, is this done or is this not? So now we've got action step, for each action step, date and accountability. Now, for those action steps and the objective, you also want to have key performance indicators. Now, the reason why you want that is because you're doing these to accomplish something. How will you know whether you're on the right track or not? You want those KPIs not just basically to measure the efficacy of our action steps. Because if we're starting to do an action step and we're expecting something to happen as a result of that and it doesn't, then that KPI tells us, well, maybe we should be approaching things in a slightly different direction. So basically, those KPIs are to help keep you on track and to tell you when and if you need to do something to change up the way that you're doing it. So, in terms of implementation, you need a roadmap and you need explicit board oversight.
Great points. And I'll share a bit of my experience, Aaron, when I'm managing my association with respect to the board oversight. And when you refer to that, and I totally agree with you. In my opinion, I think it's great to have an update or an engagement at each board meeting. What I do is I prefer to have sort of a grid of all our strategic objectives and have sort of the status on each. And if there is a red flag, a bottleneck, whatever the case may be, that's raised at each board meeting so that they know what's going on. And if there's a bottleneck, whether it be from the board end or the staff end, they're aware of it and they also have skin in the game in terms of how to mitigate it. So that's how I roll with the strategic plan. And also with the staff, I also prefer to work with them every so often, maybe every 2 weeks perhaps, and go through the list and see where we are at, what we need to achieve, what we need to focus on. So from both ends, we are covered by both the operation side as well as the strategic. That'll be my approach to it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, Asif. And as the executive director, you're the one that really needs to be on top of those dates. Every action step has a date associated with it, and it's basically your project managing the strategic plan. So exactly what you're saying, you're meeting internally to make sure your team's on track, and you're also meeting with the board to make sure that they understand what's going on. So that's an excellent approach to take.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Aaron. So let's now sort of recap on the 5 things that you talked about during this whole process. Number 1, if it's time for a new strategic plan, make time for it ASAP. Number 2, do an environmental scan first. Talk to members, stakeholders, and sponsors, as well as staff. Number 3, do your scenario analysis and have a plan for each scenario. Have your directors agree on the most likely scenarios in advance. Number 4, identify your risks and opportunities in each scenario and have a plan to either mitigate or jump on them. Number 5, create a plan for each scenario. Number 6, reconsider your government relations strategy. How can you provide?
We just want to let you know that if you want some help with your strategic planning, please reach out to us. We can definitely help. I did want to note with the environmental scan, there's different ways to do your environmental scan. You can do that by doing surveys, of course. But I find with your environmental scan, it's not that a survey is a bad idea, but there's a lot to be said for having personal conversations with your sponsors, with your members, and with your other stakeholders. People are often more inclined to have a telephone conversation with you than they are inclined to answer a survey. So keep that in mind, and I think you're going to get a lot more useful information by doing that. Maybe we can go to a live Q&A now, Kevin. What questions do we have?
Certainly. So our first question is, what's the best way to deal with a strategic plan when, you create it, but then 1 year later, it may be completely off the mark and may not address current reality of things?
Well, that's definitely a relevant question, especially in the current environment. If you did a strategic plan, a year and a half ago, well, the world's kind of changed in the last year and a half. So it might be that because the world has changed so much, it may be necessary to do a new strategic plan. But I don't suggest starting off with that. Maybe your expectations of the future are now different than they were before, but do a full review of your existing plan. What is missing? What is unrealistic? Is anything unrealistic? Do we need a new plan, or can we simply focus more on some of our strategic priorities and less on others? Or can we simply change the action steps, maybe the order of the action steps, or maybe we need to add more? Just look at what you've got already before you decide you want to throw it out because you didn't do a good job, a perfect job of predicting the future. So short answer is do a full review of the plan. If parts of it are still relevant, then you don't want to throw those out. If nothing is relevant, you just can't do any of it in the current environment, then come up with a new strategic plan that's going to get you through the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. And our final question is there a template that you can provide or recommend for an association's strategic plan?
That's a great question, and I often get asked that. And it's really not about the template that you're using. It's really more what is actually in your strategic plan. And basically, what you want is four things. You want this to be very short. You don't want something that goes on for 10 pages. And I would say you've got, in terms of length, you've got something less than a full page for each objective. And on each page, you've got your objective, why it's an objective, what you're hoping to accomplish, and then the action steps to achieve that objective. Action steps and milestones are essentially the same thing. By having those action steps, those show you what the milestones are, and so you can see how you're moving along towards your objective. You want to make sure, the third thing is you want to make sure you've got dates and accountability for each action step. If you don't have that, then it's just way too easy to put off stuff and not get around to doing it at all. So dates and accountability for each action step. Who's responsible for it and by when? And then you also want to have your KPIs. Remember, we talked about this just a few minutes ago. You want to make sure that you've got your KPIs so that you understand if you're going in the right direction. So not so much a template, but you need the four things: objectives, action steps, dates and accountability, and KPIs.
All
All
right, thanks,
right.
Aaron. That's our final question for today.
Okay, then we're hoping that you will join us for our next podcast on June 24th. We're going to be talking about revenue diversification and how can we increase non-dues revenue. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Asif. We'll see you on June 24th.